Good evening, everyone. I'd like to begin by recognizing the long history of Indigenous and Métis people in Ontario, paying my respects this evening to the communities of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations and the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, and acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Wendat Nations. I was very honored to have been contacted a while ago with the opportunity to make a presentation here, and have been bouncing my head back and forth about just what to talk about for some time. I thought one of the things that would be interesting, perhaps, I hope, is to do a synthesis of several talks so the slides look very different during different segments of the talk. I haven't gone through them all and rearranged them. But what I want to try to do is provide you with a bit of biological history, but also social context for Cootes Paradise Marsh, this 600-acre area that sits right here in Hamilton. McMaster University sits right on this marsh. It is RBG's, Royal Botanical Gardens' largest property. But I'm consciously aware, with someone who has an interest in history, that things are not today the way they were. And Royal Botanical Gardens didn't spring into existence as one piece. Cootes Paradise has a history, and yet we don't seem to talk about these things very much. For example, with Cootes Paradise Marsh, we seem to look at it as this beautiful natural wilderness. And it's been the home of people for 10,000 years. And people have changed it enormously in that time. So what I'd like to do is first get right out of the way, right at the beginning, acknowledgements about my friends and colleagues at Royal Botanical Gardens who have contributed enormously to this. I would know nothing without their help, especially Thijs Thijsmeyer, our head of natural lands. Thijs has been managing the nature sanctuaries at RBG, including Cootes Paradise Marsh now, for nearly a decade. He has a wonderful staff of ecologists and biologists with him, including Felicia there, one of our ecologists, and one of her friends. First, I hope everybody knows where Cootes Paradise Marsh is. Does anyone not know where Cootes Paradise Marsh is? Oh, that's really good. Cootes Paradise, of course, is nestled in an urban area today. It's surrounded on three sides by development, but it also has a fair bit of habitat around it which hasn't been developed. It's a geographic feature that includes connections. So all bodies of water have a watershed. And when you look at Cootes Paradise, you should also think watershed. That watershed includes the Spencer Creek, for example, which stretches way up towards Cambridge, Ontario. I believe the watershed is something on the order of 26,000 hectares. It's much, much bigger than the protected areas around it. The consequence of that, of course, is that everything that's done in that area ends up draining into Cootes Paradise Marsh. I wanted to say a few words about where this all came from, because again, I think context is really important. The wetland didn't just spring into existence. It sits within the Dundas Valley, what's called a glacial reentrant valley. During the last glaciation, a tongue of ice came in from the lake basin area and pushed westward, grinding this huge gouge into the Niagara Escarpment, forming very unique Niagara Escarpment south-facing walls in Ontario. So Dundas and the Dundas Valley has a microclimate, which is quite warm. We sometimes, in the immediate area of RBG Centre, which is within the Dundas Valley on the Aldershot side, we don't necessarily have snow every year, at least doesn't last. So Cootes Paradise is the wetland at the floor of the Dundas Valley. And it's bounded on the east side by a structure called the Burlington Heights. Even that tongue of land, which stretches north and south from Dundurn Castle up towards Burlington, is itself a fascinating landform. I sometimes do entire talks just on the Burlington Heights. It was formed about 12,500 years ago, and a little bit more than that, by what was called Lake Iroquois. The geologists called the precursor lake to Lake Ontario, Lake Iroquois. It was much deeper and bigger than Lake Ontario is today. If you think about the Burlington Heights where Dundurn Castle is, that was a sandbar in Lake Iroquois. That's how high the water level was. The Burlington Heights formed along the edge of the Dundas Valley about 12,500 years ago, and then very suddenly, Lake Iroquois went away. Somewhere else an ice dam broke. And some people think it was Hudson Valley, some people think it was further west. But the consequence was that Lake Iroquois dropped in height by something like 150 meters almost overnight. Water went way out and left behind this strip of land around which was eroded a channel. And once that channel was in place, the water that was in Cootes Paradise from that watershed would drain out over the north of the Burlington Heights for the next millennium. Now, I began, as I do almost all my presentations when I can, with an acknowledgement of Indigenous lands. And I think it's really important to understand that, again, even a place like Cootes Paradise, which we might think of as natural or nature or wilderness somehow, is a landscape that people have lived in for a very long time. You might know this spot if you're in the area. It's not a great picture. I'm sure Scott knows it in the front here. This is Princess Point. Princess Point is a little peninsula on the south shore of Cootes Paradise Marsh, which sticks up pointing towards the north. And although this photograph doesn't look particularly exciting, it's actually one of the most interesting archaeological sites in southern Ontario, because this is the site where, over the past 30 years, researchers from McMaster University and University of Toronto have found the traces of Indigenous people going right back to what's called the early Archaic period, almost 10,000 years ago. And more frequently, more recently, areas on Princess Point were inhabited by people living in what is called the woodland period, the late woodland period, especially a group of people that have come to be known informally as the Princess Point culture, although in fact the Princess Point complex is the correct technical definition of the things they leave behind. They were very skilled ceramicists. They could make wonderful pots and bowls and things, and of course that's a durable good. We can see those things now. Some of these traces are ephemeral, and one of the charms of being on the periphery of archaeology, because I'm not an archaeologist, but is working with people like archaeologists and having a chance to actually see what it means when they find something, when they look at something. This little piece of stone in the hand of my colleague Helen Haynes, for example, is only about 5 centimeters long. It's a piece of a flint point that someone possibly broke while they were using it, or maybe even making it. It was found at Princess Point 7 years ago, and it is approximately 8,000 to 10,000 years old. Those are not the time frames that we're used to thinking in southern Ontario, yet they are very real. Many of these archaeological finds don't look particularly exciting. This looks like something that was left underneath the treads of a truck. But in fact, that's some of the ceramic shards left by the people who lived at Princess Point between 1,000 and 1,500 years ago. The people who left these traces behind lived in an area roughly 100 kilometers in all directions from Cootes Paradise. We don't think Cootes Paradise was the center somehow of their distribution, but it's just worked out statistically that way. In fact, many of the best sites for this group of people are along the Grand River, the southern Grand River, where we see large habitations year-round. At Princess Point, they were there seasonally, but boy, they were having fun. One of the biggest features at Princess Point is called a midden. Does anyone know what a midden is in archaeological terms? Garbage dump, yeah. Their garbage dump was in use over 400 years on the northern tip of Princess Point. And when the archaeologists look at this material, it's not just Tim Hortons cups and candy wrappers. It's the remains of their meals. It's the bones of the fish and the frogs and the birds that they were catching and eating at Princess Point. And because of that, we have an exquisite record of the fauna living in Cootes Paradise 1,000 years ago. We also are increasingly getting good information about the plants in the area from archaeology. There are archaeologists called paleobotanists, or paleoarchaeobotanists, I should say. And they're able to take a little carbonized bit of schmutz and figure out what it was. One of the most enchanting things is that the Princess Point people seem to have been the first people in eastern North America to practice maize agriculture. They were on the verge of becoming agriculturists, or horticulturists 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. They have recovered maize kernels at Princess Point, more of them at places like the Grand River. This is an astonishing thought, the birth of North American horticulture in the Northeast, and by accident, it's part of Canada's largest botanical garden today. Now, I haven't got time to go over everything we know, and in fact, much more what we don't know about Indigenous people in our area, and really that's not my story to relate. All I can do is indicate what the archaeologists have shown me. I do not mean in any sense to tell the stories of Indigenous people. They should be telling those stories themselves. Our story around Cootes Paradise catches up with someone, guess whose last name it was? Coote. Who was Thomas Coote? Well, I can tell you a little bit about Thomas Coote, and we're learning more all the time. The gentleman in the photograph there is my dear friend Jack Lord. Jack was a naturalist and writer at Royal Botanical Gardens who started on staff in the 1970s. He retired about 12 years ago. And Jack, as sadly I am becoming, Jack became obsessed with Thomas Coote. Who was he? What did he do? Why is he given his name to Cootes Paradise Marsh? He did a lot of research. He actually found some of Thomas Cootes' military records at places like Fort Niagara in New York State. And in the past 4 or 5 years, I've been expanding the net, making use literally of the net, to look at new resources that are available online. What we know is that he was born around 1743 to an Irish family in the southern part of Ireland, although his family ultimately was English. He was in the English army as a lieutenant. Strange thing though, he was a lieutenant in his 30s. And that meant he wasn't a social climber. He wasn't doing very well as an officer to still be a lieutenant when he was in his mid-30s. Possibly to try to rescue his family from financial ruin, he joined the army and came to North America during the American Revolutionary War. There were very few settlers and European people in this area before 1800, and the huge influence of United Empire loyalists coming north, a huge influx, I should say. So Coote was before that. He was here during the American Revolutionary War period. And what's interesting about Coote is that the name stuck to the wetland somehow. We don't know exactly how. He was not a great soldier. He wasn't some guy on a horse with a point, go there and kill them. He wasn't that kind of guy. He came to the wetland to go fishing. He came to the wetland on his days off to go hunting. So here we have this very large geographical feature whose name has persisted since at least 1791, when it shows up on a surveyor's map created by Augustus Jones as Cootes Paradise. And the name has stuck all this time. And it wasn't because it was even designated by some potentate like John Ray Simcoe, who will come into the story at the next slide. It's because apparently he made an impression with his friends back at the fort at the Niagara River that he really loved going here to fish. So it could be called Tom's Fishing Hole. Instead we call it Cootes Paradise. The fact that we know the name at all, apart from these rare maps like Augustus Jones prepared, is that Elizabeth Simcoe, John Gray Simcoe's wife, came to the Burlington Heights in the summer of 1796. While she was there, she did things like paint drawings in her diary, which exist in the Ontario archives. She remarked in her diary how splendid a table Richard Beasley set. She was visiting Richard Beasley, a trader on the Burlington Heights. And she loved the tortoises he was serving her, and salmon. Tortoises, of course, being snapping turtles. In her diary, she also recorded that Cootes Paradise is named after a Captain Thomas Coote. He was a lieutenant. A Captain Thomas Coote, an old soldier of the 8th Regiment of Foot. In fact, he was in the 34th when he left. There may be a reason for that discrepancy. Who liked to come to the wetland to hunt and fish. That's the narrative account we have, one sentence in Elizabeth Simcoe's diary, and one name recorded in a map made 5 years earlier. We're pretty sure we know who Thomas Coote was. We've got records now about his family. He was married. She stayed in Ireland while he was away. We know about some of his cousins. He had a really weird cousin named Coote, which I won't get into. Coote. The fantastic thing about Thomas, as I said, is it's not because he was some great war leader. Now, John Gray Simcoe enters the story in 1814 when he decides that the town of Cootes Paradise should be named after his friend Henry. And he changed the name to Henry Dundas. So the town of Dundas is named after the first Viscount Melville in Scotland, who never visited North America, because Simcoe liked his name better, I suppose, than Coote. So I know a lot of people are very ardent about the retention of the identity of Dundas after it amalgamated with Hamilton. I think we should put the name back and call it Cootes Paradise. That's a joke. Now, it isn't going to happen. Now, Cootes Paradise Marsh starts showing up in the literature in the 1820s, and there's a fascinating account of Cootes published by a British government engineer named John McTaggart in the late 1820s. He was there in 1826. And he said something like in his book, Cootes Paradise is a very singular place. It derives its name from a sportsman called Coote, who considered himself in paradise when he got amongst the numerous flocks of wild waterfowl that haunt it. He would move about with his boat amongst the rushes and shoot them by the dozens. Boy. Now this is an engineer, a colonial engineer who is surveying the Canadas for natural resources on behalf of the English. He wrote, I have never seen such a variety of wild fowl as come to this place. It is therefore strongly recommended to ornithologists and sportsmen as a place above all others yet known in Canada, most deserving of attention. That's after he had surveyed the rest of Canada. He thought Cootes Paradise, if you like birds, go there. That was his idea. Now, of course, he went on to suggest that it should be filled in and turned into a farm. He thought it was so biologically productive that it would make a wonderful rice farm. Again, this is a guy who's thinking in colonial terms. He's thinking in advancement of economy. He's also thinking about health. And this is one of the points at which this little talk in a rambling way interacts with considerations around health and water. Because in the 1820s, people didn't like marshes. Marshes were considered to be the source of disease. There may have been some cause to think that way when you think about malaria. The malaria was endemic here, and the word means bad air. Malaria. Of course, there was the germ theory of disease hadn't caught up with the mosquitoes yet. So there may be some reason for that, because he does, in his account, slag off Cootes Paradise as being an unremitting hellhole because it's a marsh. There are other British accounts in the first part of the 19th century that say the same thing. But again, I think that's to be expected in the context. That's the way they viewed a large wetland. Cootes Paradise came into attention, in fact, a few years before. As the Loyalists were arriving in the area, and as people like Richard Beasley set up their trading establishment on the Burlington Heights, it came to the attention of the British military as a defensible location. And so in the last week of May, 1813, when the British were routed from Niagara, they marched from the Niagara River to Hamilton and commandeered Richard Beasley's establishment, where Dundurn Castle is today. And they spent a week reorganizing themselves, and on the morning of the 6th of June, 1813, they went to Stony Creek, and they defeated the Americans at Stony Creek. An attack launched from the Burlington Heights. We don't have too many contemporary accounts of the site, but, and I don't want to dwell overly on any particular area, although I will mention some of them. But this area in particular for me has a great deal of resonance and even pathos. You might know the site on the Burlington Heights where there's a large stone on an elevated platform. Maps, but very little else, record that this is the site of a military graveyard during the War of 1812. When the British had taken over the Burlington Heights and turned it into a fort, they apparently buried their military dead at the site. Another disease issue, which is again directly related to both human habitation and water, is cholera. And Hamilton was hit with two significant waves of cholera in the 19th century. One in 1832-33 and one in 1854-55. And at least the cholera graves, although it's not recorded on that plaque, which dates from 1926, we believe there was at least one mass grave on the Burlington Heights from those cholera victims in Hamilton in 1832-33. In the subsequent years, I think the attitude towards Cootes Paradise Marsh maybe mellowed a little bit. Artists started representing it as a place of beauty. John Caddy painted several watercolors of the area, including various segments of Cootes Paradise and Hamilton Harbor. But people like to transform things. And something that we don't think about today, perhaps, is the way we were 200 years ago in terms of civic development. I have kind of what I call my scaffold theory about human society, which is that every stage of human society is a scaffold for the next stage. It changes. It doesn't necessarily reflect what was before. If you go back 190 years, the town of Dundas, the town of Ancaster, and the town of Hamilton were all about the same size. And they were all vying for commercial and social relevance and preeminence. And in 1820, a young man who had been a royalist and had left France during the time of the French Revolution started working with his boss, a guy named Richard Hatt, and said, let's build a canal through that wetland so we can get supplies from Dundas, or from Lake Ontario into Dundas, and our finished products from Dundas out to Lake Ontario and shipping ports. Because there was everything in Dundas. There were mills, there were tanneries, there were carpentry shops. It was a center for industry because of the water coming down Spencer's Creek. Late 18th century, early 19th century, water power was power. Even before steam engines were available, if you had some wood, you could build a water mill, a water-powered mill. And Dundas was full of industry and attracted people like William Lyon Mackenzie, who had business interests in Dundas in the 1820s. So after a lot of maneuvering, a canal was built from the town of Dundas right out to Hamilton Harbor. Now it took a long time. One of the reasons was that the guy behind it, Peter Desjardins, died very suddenly. It's a sad story, but I love telling it. So Desjardins was trying to finance this big vision he had. His initial idea for the canal was that it should be a monumental structure, 12 feet wide, 35 feet deep, running from Dundas to the marsh, essentially straightening out Spencer's Creek. And from there, boats could make it out to Hamilton Harbor. He started clearing Spencer's Creek in 1820. And by about 1825, you could bring a boat out to the marsh. But it wasn't enough. As industry was growing, you needed bigger capacity for more ships. And so he started doing everything he could to raise money to build a big canal. He sold his own farm to invest in his own canal. But it was rough going. There were a lot of people who didn't like the project and didn't like him. There was a lot of opposition to the project. He was saddling his horse one morning in 1827 in Grimsby, and the horse killed him. He was trying to get the saddle on it, and whether he bucked and was kicked by the horse, I haven't seen that much detail, but his own horse did him in. I guess he didn't like the canal either. And today, because he was destitute, because he put every cent he had into this canal, Pierre Desjardins, or Peter Desjardins, is buried in the back of St. Andrew's Church in Grimsby without a headstone. He's there somewhere. Now, the canal itself was an interesting proposition. It operated from about 1835-36 until the 1860s when it went bankrupt. It was only in operation about 30 years. And in the middle of that period, they did a big revision to it. They straightened it out by digging a hole through the Burlington Heights. There's a big gap in the Burlington Heights today where the big pointy bridge is. That is 1840s. That's the second stage of that canal. So they went through the entire expense of digging that ditch through the Burlington Heights, and in less than 12 years, the canal company was bankrupt. It was a private company, and when it went bankrupt, the ownership of the canal reverted to the town of Dundas. But it left the wetland forever changed. Cootes Paradise, before all these interventions in the last 2 centuries, was about 90% emergent vegetation. You could look down on it from the Burlington Heights and not see water, because it was cattails for hundreds of acres. It looked like a plain. Some early descriptions describe it from above as a grassland. We think there's a grassland down there. Well, it's actually cattails in a marsh. But again, you can actually go down there and touch history. It's fascinating in the wintertime if you get down there. If the water level is low enough, you can still see the huge oak pilings poking up through the ice and touch a piece of wood that's been sitting there for 180 years. I mean, that's enchanting to me. And this is not a matter of little rowboats either. This is downtown Dundas around 1860. A steamship. There were steamships and schooners regularly coming in and out of Dundas from Lake Ontario. There was a shipbuilding enterprise in downtown Dundas. Roughly where Canadian Tire is now. They sell canoes. So think about change. Change in this case literally born by water, by the lifeblood of the community until the railroads came in And not just the railroads, but also toll roads. They were coming in at about the same time in the middle of the 19th century. Between the toll road network and railroads, they undercut the profitability of the canal, and as I've mentioned, in the 1860s it was done. It left a huge hole in the ground. This is a photograph from around 1897. To bridge that hole in the ground, they had to build bridges. And at this time, they were building the third of those bridges across the gap in the Burlington Heights. And this photograph, I think, is really neat because it lets you see what the Burlington Heights is made of. It's entirely compacted sand and gravel. There's no stone there at all. Now that becomes an interesting point of trivia for Royal Botanical Gardens. It doesn't do too much for Cootes Paradise, but I will touch on its implications a little bit later. Throughout the 20th century, the marsh changed dramatically. In this photograph around 1920, you can see the remains of the canal. It's been abandoned for 50 years at this point as a commercial enterprise. You can see now that the canal is quite open to Cootes Paradise. These boards are gone. The water can go back and forth. There's a little boat sitting there. But Cootes Paradise has not changed in one fundamental respect. It's very shallow. Depending upon the time of year and which year it is, much of Cootes Paradise is exposed as mudflats. It's only about 1 meter deep on average. So you have to boat in there very carefully. I don't know if you've noticed something else in this photograph though, which is staggeringly interesting from a social perspective. Do you see those little buildings? Yeah. Along both sides of the Burlington Heights, around the canal, they're developed a community that's sometimes called the squatters, sometimes called the boathouse community. I don't see either Ken or Nancy here, but two history professors here at McMaster, Ken Cruikshank and Nancy Boucher, have written extensively on the boathouse community. They published a paper about 14 years ago called The War on the Squatters. And it really puts the development of what's to come in an interesting context, because these people were almost squatting. They had no legal right to be there. They would go fishing on Cootes Paradise. They'd sell their fish downtown. They'd buy a couple of nails and they'd put something else on their house. Very, very poor people in general in terms of their financial status. But they lived very close to nature. They were living right next to this place where you could go out in the wetland and you could shoot a duck and have supper. You could fish and you could have something to eat or to sell for your family. The community, the boathouse community, has had some interesting press recently. There was a novelist who used to live in Hamilton. She's out in British Columbia now, named Rachel Preston, who's written a novel, a fictionalized account of living on Cootes Paradise, The Fishers of Paradise. It is a wonderful novel. And we have a few photographs like this in our corporate archives at RBG. Just giving you some idea of what those shacks look like. Now, so this is Cootes Paradise adjacent. Planners, of course, love to change things, and the first 20th century effort to change Cootes Paradise fortunately fell flat on its face. This man was very interesting. Nolan Cushon was a railway engineer from Ottawa, Ontario, who made a living during the First World War going around to cities in Ontario telling them what to do. He prepared a report. There is an onion skin copy in the Hamilton Local Archives at the library downtown of his report, which was published on the 1st of October, 1917. So we are just at the centenary of Nolan Cushon's interesting report. I suspect in reading that report, which is, by the way, more like poetry than something you'd expect from a civil engineer, there's no diagrams, there's no statistics. He has numbered stanzas throughout this report where he elaborates on things from why it's important that a university should be built, or how magnificent gardens are, or all these kinds of things. Fascinating article, a fascinating thing. He thought that there were 3 things in Hamilton that made it a spectacular city and that should be elaborated. One of them was the beach strip. It should become some kind of public recreation space down in Hamilton Harbor. One of them was the mountain. He recognized the escarpment gave Hamilton a unique aspect 100 years ago. And the third was the Burlington Heights. And he proposed that the Burlington Heights be cleaned up and turned into a park, because by 1917 it had a road going through it to Toronto. Anybody coming from Toronto to Hamilton had to drive up that road, and it was a 4-mile-long slum. There were old houses, there were billboards, there were fences, there were telegraph wires, and there were gravel pits all over the place on the Burlington Heights. It was ugly. And this was supposed to be Hamilton, the ambitious city's front porch. Couchon suggested it should be cleaned up and turned into Hamilton's great entranceway. It took 9 years, but City Council did buy the Burlington Heights in 1926 and decided they were going to clean up this entranceway and give Hamilton some curb appeal. Now at the time, in the 1920s, there was also this young man on the scene, Thomas Baker McQuestion. McQuestion was a lawyer by training. He was from a Hamilton family, although he was born up in Cambridge, what's now Cambridge. And one of the reasons why we talk about McQuestion an awful lot at RBG is we consider him to be our founder. For over 20 years, he worked on the project of creating Royal Botanical Gardens. It was his longest single project. He got involved because he was on the Hamilton Board of Park Management, and his driving passion was city beautification. So while he was on that board, early on, for example, in the 1920s, they created Gage Park in Hamilton. That was one of his projects. It was resisted by a lot of people because they thought all that land should become houses, so they pay taxes. And instead, he said, we need more parks. In 1927, with McQuestion pushing the idea, the Board of Park Management, which was the civic body at the time, purchased the south shore of Cootes Paradise Marsh. It was in contention, it was up for sale, there were competing ideas. Some people thought it should be turned into a duck farm. In his report, Nolan Couchon says, let's drain Cootes Paradise Marsh and turn it into an airport. It's a great one. Poor Nolan Couchon. I've seen academic articles about his life that say he must have died very disappointed because nothing he ever designed was ever built. I can give you the reference later if you want that. All kinds of things were happening in this little bit of time in the late 1920s. In 1927, the William Henry family, one of the very prominent industrial families in Hamilton, gave Hamilton the farm. They had a farm in Aldershot called the Valley Farm. And William Henry had gotten it big in construction. He was building things, he was building roads and bridges, and he was into cartage. And they raised racehorses and draft horses in Aldershot in the 19th century. But by the 1920s, the market for draft horses had kind of gone down unless you're making ads for Budweiser. And so they sold off some of the land for buildings and houses. If you drive down Plains Road in Aldershot, all those houses on the north side of Plains Road are on the former farm. And he gave the remainder of the farm to the city of Hamilton on the condition that it be a park in perpetuity. So Hamilton now has this great big block of land in Aldershot, which is now Burlington because of a mistake in 1960. They put the line between the cities in the wrong place. It has the Burlington Heights, with projects on it to beautify the Burlington Heights. And it has the south shore of Cootes Paradise, all part of the portfolio of the Board of Park Management. And they have something else. They have Calvin McQuestion. And they have people like Robert Owen Merriman, who, together with others in the community, formed a group called the Hamilton Bird Protection Society in the 1920s. We know the same group today as the Hamilton Naturalist Club. A fantastic, fantastic group with this amazing history. Now, Calvin is as interesting a character as his brother. He was older, but he lived longer. When he died at the age of 91, I believe, he left the family house to the city of Hamilton as a museum. That's Whitehurst in downtown Hamilton, now used almost weekly as a set for Murdoch Mysteries. They were there 2 weeks ago again. Calvin was a naturalist. This is his canoe on Cootes Paradise. He actually, if you go to the museum today, you can see the wicker backrest from his canoe sitting in his bedroom all these years later. He also was a Presbyterian minister and a journalist, and he was arguing all the time for the protection of Cootes Paradise Marsh. There are photographs of him in Cootes Paradise with Jack Miner, the noted conservationist who also believed in tying religious messages to geese feet. Don't worry about the motivation, what matters is the results. So, and that's again only intended as a humorous aside. These guys in the 1920s, for some reason, had the foresight to look at a place like Cootes Paradise and not see filling it in for houses or draining it for a farm, but to protect it as a wetland, as a productive space, even for things like hunting and fishing. Although in 1874, Cootes Paradise was legally scheduled by the province of Ontario as a fish sanctuary, and in 1927 was protected as a game sanctuary by the province as well. It's considered still to be a very significant Great Lakes coastal wetland. It has been degraded over the years by factors we'll get to in a minute. And what's amazing about this spot, in my view anyway, is that it's, I'm looking for the term, it's a great way to talk to people about the environment, because everyone's got their own experiences with the wetland. Everyone sees it from a different point of view. Some people like to go there just for a walk, some people like to go there to view birds, some people go there to fish. The stories around history are there, the stories around even things like the city beautification project in the 1930s. By 1934, in fact, the Board of Park Management in the city of Hamilton had more acreage of parks than any other city in Canada. That's how far ahead Hamilton was in 1934. They also had an interesting problem, which is that the city council had said that the board could not have more than 2,000 acres of parkland, because there was a consequence to every acre. It cost more. You have another acre, you have to pay somebody to take care of it, and that comes off the mill rate. So think about that as we go forward. So in the late 1920s, the city of Hamilton has this strip of land along the edge of Burlington Heights called the called the Burlington Heights. And it's, as I've described it, it's a mess. It's covered with ramshackle buildings. It's got holes in the ground for all sorts of purposes like gravel pits. So what they did was to propose a contest for ideas about how to decorate the Burlington Heights. And they put out a big call, and they received 12 finalist entries. The 3 finalists were John Lyle, who eventually designed Union Station in downtown Toronto. Laurie Dunnington and Howard Grubb are husband and wife couple that ran landscape architecture and town planning company. Today they're not necessarily remembered very much, but have you ever heard of Sheridan Nurseries? They created Sheridan Nurseries because they couldn't get the plants they wanted for their company. And they were in the town of Sheridan. And Carl Borgstrom. I'll mention each of these in a couple of minutes. Each of these entrants had ideas about how to decorate the area and make it more beautiful. And the board was not dependent upon talking about any one of them. They actually pulled all kinds of ideas from different people. I'm going to try to skip forward quickly but coherently. The designs that came forward for this beautification of the Burlington Heights in the 1920s were staggering. If you look for Mark Osbaldiston's new book, Unbuilt Hamilton, this is on the cover. This is one of the unbuilt designs. It became this, the bridge over the cut through the Burlington Heights. This is now in stylized form the corporate logo of the city of Hamilton, right over the cut in the Burlington Heights. There were all sorts of ideas about what to do up there to beautify it. Build museums. Some people wanted to build museums up there. That was perfectly allowed in the competition. The winner was Wilson, Bennell, and Borgstrom. Carl Borgstrom was noted for being a landscape designer with a naturalistic point of view. He didn't want you to think you were in Versailles. He wanted you to think you were in Algonquin Park. Their design for the entire area was stunning, and thank goodness it didn't work. One of the things they proposed was to build a causeway from the Burlington Heights over to Princess Point, which would cut 20 minutes off the trip to McMaster University from Toronto. And if they had done it, they would have plowed the archaeology at Princess Point. They crowed over it. This was Toronto Star in 1929. McQuestion Ghost wrote an article telling everybody how fantastic his plans were. The one big feature that has survived on the Burlington Heights is RBG's Rock Garden. Now, I emphasized in the beginning of my talk that that gravel pit in which it was built was a gravel pit. There was no stone there. So where does the stone in the rock garden come from? In fact, it comes from the Niagara Escarpment. During 2 years, 10,000 tons of limestone were quarried and taken down into that gravel pit to build that rock garden. And there are gardens missing today. There was a garden just south of the rock garden called the Memorial Garden, which was built as a memorial to the end of the First World War. Today, all that's left is the ruins of this little reflecting pool. Another garden that's gone completely, at the entrance to McMaster University, was an RBG garden called the Sunken Garden. It was built by McQuestion's group. It was designed by Howard Dunnington grub, and it became part of RBG in the 1930s. In 1963, RBG sold the land to McMaster University, and this was removed, and that's where the McMaster Hospital is today. Some people ask why we're royal. Again, another whole long story, but to put it quickly, we have a memo. King George V acquiesced to Thomas Baker McQuestion's ambitions and said, yes, you can call the botanical garden that was planned for the south shore of Cootes Paradise Marsh Royal Botanical Gardens in 1930. Nothing more complicated and no connections. We've never been visited by a British royal. So in 1932, RBG consisted of the south shore of Cootes Paradise Marsh, the Burlington Heights, and then some of this land is actually under the castle, the city park, and the Valley Farm up in Aldershot. And there are wonderful maps from the 1930s that show the details. So in the middle here, for example, this is the 50 acres that was reserved for the McMaster campus. McMaster University was a university in Toronto and moved and set up campus in Hamilton in 1930. And all around it on three sides, there was the intention of building a botanical garden. The campus would sit in what was called the Sylvan Ring. Botany has started early on. We've had people like Harold Senn, for example, who in the early 1930s went into what was called Royal Botanical Gardens and surveyed the trees. We have records about what was there in the habitat along the south shore of Cootes Paradise. In 1941, McQuestion gets an act through the province of Ontario creating RBG as an independent not-for-profit corporation. And he gets the land transferred to the corporation's ownership, which gets them around the problem of having 2,000 acres of land in the city parks. So now he's got room to make more parks, because all that land is now part of Royal Botanical Gardens. It's not City of Hamilton anymore. It's an independent corporation. Since that time, our botanizing has continued along the north and south shore and all of our properties. And one of the interesting revelations of the last decade is that this land that's been protected through this strange set of machinations over the last decades may arguably be Canada's biodiversity hotspot in terms of species richness. We have more of the wild plants of Canada growing on that property than anywhere else. 38% of the flora of the province of Ontario in 10 square kilometers. And it's for a couple of reasons. One is it's sampling effort. The more you look, the more you find. And we've had botanists going at this now for 70 years. But part of it is because it's the intersection of several habitats. There's oak savanna, there's cliff ecology areas of the natural escarpment, there's bits of the Carolinian forest zone, there's bits of the deciduous forest of the Great Lakes, all in this one area. Endangered species are all over the place. There's over 50 listed endangered species growing wild at RBG. Plants, invertebrates, birds, mammals. My favorite are the endangered mollusks. Did you know that Southern Ontario is the center of biological diversity for freshwater clams? It is. We have more freshwater mollusk species than anything else, really, except for maybe Canada geese. And there is an endangered clam at RBG, an endangered freshwater mussel. I'm going to talk a little bit about the different gardens at RBG. You can come and you can see the gardens. The gardens are easily accessible. The thing that holds us together as a glue is this commitment to the idea that we should be trying to connect people with plants. If they want to come to natural areas, we got natural areas. If they want to do gardening, we have gardens. We will try to help you connect to the world of plants for all sorts of really good positive reasons. Everything from it's incredibly beautiful to things like horticultural therapy. In the 1970s, RBG staff pioneered the idea that you can use gardening as a form of occupational therapy and help people become more centered, help people have calmer lives, because the process of gardening takes time, and you work with your hands and you work with another species, and all those things have a meditative aspect that is extremely important for human health. I'm going to try to flip right to the end now and just show you where we are with some of our nature sanctuary work, because again, I can do another talk later on RBG if you like, and I expect that's where an awful lot of you are interested. The big question for Royal Botanical Gardens is, where are the plants in the wetland? Most of them have been pushed back. This slide shows it very well. From aerial photographs in the 1930s, we know that about 3/4 of the wetland was covered with emergent vegetation, but by 1985, 90% of that was gone, and much of what was left were exotic species. the wetland had not fared very well under human management for the past century. There was garbage all over the place. Now, fortunately, since the 1950s and going on into the present day, there's an enormous number of community members who help clean up wetlands like this. Is anybody here from the Stewards of Cootes Watershed? Woohoo! The Stewards of Cootes Watershed, and now their new group that Alan's created, the Stewards of the Red Hill Watershed, are a volunteer group that go into these areas with landowner permission and do things like pull out bowling balls and shopping carts and an amazing variety of weird stuff that gets dumped in wetlands by people who perhaps aren't thinking. We've been trying very hard over the years to convey all this to people. 1955, for example, at the Canadian Sportsman Show, RBG had a wetland display. Who was talking about the dynamics of wetlands in 1955 at a sportsman show? We were. In the 1970s, and this is Al in this picture, guys? I don't know. In the 1970s, people were going into the wetland doing crazy things like scrapping canoes together and pulling out tires and drums. And what we do now to take care of the land is we set it on fire. Prairie habitats are maintained by fire naturally. And a very important management tool are controlled burns. We do this at several of our sites. Now, the wetland itself is of course, central to all of this. Much of what I've described is around the edges. The challenges for plants in wetland include things like water level. Water on the Great Lakes is maintained artificially high to promote shipping. That means that the emergent vegetation in a lot of the marsh gets drowned, and there's nothing we can do about that. Water quality is very important. That's been improving. The sewage treatment plant in Dundas is a very good sewage treatment plant for the municipality. We certainly would like to see some more cleanup there. Our big concern now, in fact, are pharmaceuticals coming into the wetland through the sewage treatment plant. One of the big issues, of course, are carp. And carp are known at RBG as enemy one. Our goals all have to do with the restoration of water quality and fish, or water quality and plant distribution. And I wanted to take a second, but I'm worrying about my time now, to show you this quick vid. Because this dates from 1959. It's actually a Super 8mm film, or a regular 8mm film. And unfortunately, I can't advance it too quickly, but the very last minute of it is staggering. This shows the carp of 57 years ago. So let's try to take a peek at that. There's a sign that says, Dundas Marsh Game Preserve. The hunting, trapping of, I can read that, and there's ducks. They did have ducks back then, it's really good. Big ducks. But there are other species as well that are captured in this. This film is 40 minutes long. We don't know who shot it, but it's been sitting in our archives for 50 years. And it doesn't just show the wetlands like this section of Cootes Paradise Marsh with some swans. It doesn't just show the wetlands, it also shows the garden areas as they were. There's great blue heron, green heron. Always looking at you over his nose. This guy. So I think we're getting really close to the wetland part now. Carp came into Lake Ontario in the 1870s. They were brought in on purpose as a game fish, as a food fish. And one reason was that we were killing off the Atlantic salmon that lived in the lake naturally. What they do in the springtime is swim into shallow areas, and their tails, as they are spawning, whip up the substrate, and that wipes out the plants. These guys are purse seining for fish in Cootes Paradise 60 years ago. They're beating the reeds with sticks to try to drive the carp into the nets. And in the nets, now if you actually look carefully, you might be able to spot some of the fish. There are a lot of things like brown bullheads, which are perfectly fine native species. That's our most common species still in the wetland. But pretty quickly you get an idea of the carp. And this is now an Olympic sport, carp tossing. He's tossing carp into this boat to pull them out. They were trying almost 60 years ago to reduce the number of carp. That's a big female. Reduce the number of carp in this wetland. Now, it was a pretty thankless task. The fish were extremely successful. They're coming into the wetland from all over the western end of the lake. But the effort to take care of the carp continues. And today, our main site for that is the Cootes Paradise Fishway. This is a structure across the only opening into Cootes Paradise, that old canal. So this is another use for the canal. Because there is that one opening, we can put a fish filter on it, the Cootes Paradise Fishway, and stop the adult carp. So this is a cage that comes out of the water looking like this. If you could look down inside it, this is what you would see. Those are all adult carp about to be sorted. The carp are just sent back to Lake Ontario. The native species are allowed to go in whichever direction they were trying to. This has been successful. It's not perfect, it's not a finished job, but at one point we were estimating there were 800 kilograms of fish per hectare in this wetland. And that's gone way down, and other species have gone up. So from 1997, when the fishway opened up, the red bars are carp. The blue bars are other species. Right away, there was a big decline in carp numbers coming to the fishway. They have gone up and down a little bit in the subsequent years. But the good news is that since the fishway was started, the number of adult carp is down about a third of what it was. We have other huge changes, huge challenges. Fragility australis, for example, is an invasive weed, a reed that's in a lot of areas. We've targeted several areas, including along the shore of Spencer Creek. It is possible to remove Phragmites, but you have to nuke them. You have to get in there with Roundup, and with tractors, and with bulldozers. And it is possible to reduce and eliminate on a local scale Phragmites australis. And we've been replanting the marsh with cattails, targeting specific areas on the north and south shore where we're changing the flow of water to slow it down, to keep it in the wetland longer. And we've been restoring wild native lilies, other species like sedges and rushes, and wild rice. Up to 1,000 years ago, Cootes Paradise was mostly wild rice. And the core samples we have from the archaeologists show the shift in pollen grains to cattails about 1,000 years ago. The great news is the vegetation is up, especially in the last 6 or 7 years. That's partly because carp is being controlled, and it's partly because we're planting an awful lot of plants. In some places we've put 10,000 cattails along the north shore of Cootes Paradise. Thomas Baker McQuestion, see I've stretched it, I'm finishing it. He wrote this, which is something that all of us who are involved in trying to change the world have to keep in mind. I have often said, I can't do his voice, we have no recordings of it. I have often said that we have to do good by stealth in this world. And of course it is a fact of life which is evident in many activities that a man who is striving to occupy himself with what are undoubtedly higher things is called upon to meet never-ending difficulties in the way of performing them. He was an amazing chap, definitely worth looking at the story of T.B. McQuestion. I'd like to also end with a thought about landscape. I do not believe that we can replace landscape with money. We can change it, but for the connection that landscape has to people and to the human spirit and to the water that flows through it and gives it life, we should take account of people like Lawrence Durrell, who wrote, "We are the children of our landscape. It dictates behavior and even thought in the measure to which we are responsive to it." That's from his novel, Justine, and that's from Cootes Paradise Marsh. Thank you very much.